The cafe sat on a corner where sunlight spilled generously through wide glass windows. Inside, it was warm and alive with small details: the gentle hiss of the espresso machine, the clinking of cups against saucers, the hum of quiet conversations, and the smell of roasted coffee beans mingling with the sweetness of pastries. It wasn't grand or glamorous, but it was the kind of place that seemed to hold time in its palms, slowing the world to a gentle rhythm. The boy came there often, drawn not so much by the drinks, but by the comfort the cafe provided. It gave him a place where he could simply sit without purpose, watching steam curl upward from his cup, watching people drift in and out. He found peace in observing the world move around him while remaining still. The girl discovered the cafe by chance on a rainy afternoon. Drawn in by the warm glow behind the windows, she found herself charmed by its quiet hum. From then on, she returned, each visit a small ritual, choosing a pastry from the glass case, finding a seat near the window, and letting herself be wrapped in the cozy cadence of the place. Their first encounter was not dramatic. He had taken his usual corner seat, sipping slowly, when she entered and settled near the window across from him. Their eyes met briefly in the reflection of the glass, and both looked away quickly, as if caught trespassing in a stranger's solitude. Yet something lingered in that moment, like a note struck on piano keys that continued to hum even after the touch was gone. The cafe, with its endless flow of days, became their shared stage. At first, it was simply coincidence. He would be there reading the menu board, and she would appear moments later, brushing raindrops from her umbrella. He would arrive late in the morning to sip his coffee in silence, and she would already be there, stirring sugar into her cup. They didn't speak, but their eyes began to find each other more often through reflections on glass. Across the gentle steam rising from cups, in the shifting light of afternoons that softened into evenings. Soon, small gestures began to form an unspoken bond. She had a habit of leaving half a pastry untouched, a perfect portion resting neatly on the edge of the plate. When she left, the boy would notice and smile faintly, not daring to touch it, but appreciating the small ritual. In turn, he began leaving sugar packets unopened beside his cup, as though offering them to no one in particular. She noticed. Though she never used them, her gaze lingered for a second longer each time before drifting away. The cafe's atmosphere became an accomplice in their story. In the mornings, sunlight painted golden streaks across the tables, and they shared the same light as they sat in their separate seats. In the afternoons, shadows stretched across the wooden floor, and their presence seemed to soften the quiet hours between rushes. In the evenings, when the cafe's lamps glowed warmly, their reflections mingled in the window glass, blending their outlines into one. Over time, the distance between them shrank. He moved from the corner seat to one near the window, while she began choosing a table a little closer to his. Their visits aligned as though guided by instinct. Sometimes they arrived within minutes of each other. Other times, one was already waiting when the other walked in. No words were exchanged, yet the certainty of the other's presence became an anchor. The baristas noticed, though they said nothing. Cups for him and plates for her began to appear on the counter with quiet anticipation. Regulars passing through may not have known their names, but they recognized the rhythm, the way they occupied the cafe with a silence that felt less like distance and more like harmony. Seasons passed through the cafe like changing flavors. In spring, cherry blossoms clung to the window panes, carried in by the breeze when doors opened. She would sometimes press a fallen petal between the pages of the book she carried. He, noticing, began to linger near the blossoms outside before entering, often brushing petals from his sleeves as he stepped inside. It was a quiet exchange, she collecting the world's small beauties, he carrying them with him unconsciously. Summer brought brightness. Sunlight spilled harsh and warm, and the cafe became a refuge from the heat. She often ordered iced drinks, condensation dripping down the glass, while he stuck with steaming coffee despite the season. When he fanned himself with a menu in the heat, she hid a smile behind her hand. When she pressed her cold glass against her cheek, he watched with a kind of fond amusement. Their eyes would meet, and for a fleeting moment, the cafe felt cooler, lighter. Autumn painted the cafe in shades of amber and rust. Outside, leaves tumbled across the sidewalks, and inside, pumpkin pastries and spiced drinks filled the air with warmth. She often wore scarves, their edges trailing as she leaned forward to sip. He sometimes brought gloves, setting them carefully on the table before wrapping his hands around his cup. The sight of each other wrapped in the season's embrace deepened their quiet connection. On one afternoon, she arranged the leaves she had collected into a neat circle on her table before leaving. Hours later, he saw it and added one more leaf to the center, a small echo of her gesture. Winter turned the cafe into a haven. Snow dusted the windows, and frost clung to the corners of glass. Inside, warmth and light glowed against the cold. She often ordered hot chocolate, leaving faint traces of cream on her lips, while he stuck with coffee, his breath rising faintly as he cupped it close. Once, she shaped the foam in her drink with a spoon into a heart before letting it dissolve. Later that evening, he ordered the same drink for the first time, smiling faintly as the foam swirled. The rituals they built grew into something precious. She left behind little marks of her presence, crumbs shaped deliberately, spoons resting at certain angles, coasters turned sideways. He noticed every detail and began to respond in kind, placing his stir stick neatly parallel to hers, folding napkins in similar shapes, leaving space on the bench as though saving it for her. Their conversation was silent, but their dialogue was endless. The cafe's walls witnessed their story with patient familiarity. The baristas continued to serve them with knowing smiles. The chairs by the window grew worn where they sat most often. The glass reflected them day after day, side by side though, never speaking, like characters in a quiet film playing only for them. One evening, near the close of winter, the cafe was quieter than usual. The snow outside fell thick, muffling the world in white. Inside, only a few customers lingered. She arrived, brushing flakes from her coat, and saw him already there, waiting. She placed her order, chose her seat, and when she turned, she found a small plate already sitting where she often placed her pastries. On it rested a single macaron, its pastel color bright against the white dish. He had ordered it, left it for her, and returned to his own seat. She paused, her breath catching, before sitting down. Slowly, she picked it up, took a delicate bite, and let the sweetness linger. When she glanced up, his eyes met hers. Neither smiled widely, neither spoke. But their gaze held everything, a recognition that what had begun as coincidence had grown into something more. From then on, their bond carried a new certainty. They no longer lingered at opposite ends of the cafe, but sat closer, their tables often side by side. Their cups sometimes touched edges on the table, and their coats brushed as they hung them on the same rack. They continued their rituals, weaving small gestures into each day, but now their eyes carried an unmistakable warmth, the unspoken comfort of two people who had found home in each other. Spring returned, bringing blossoms once more. She pressed petals into the sleeve of her book, and he carried them in on his coat. The cafe filled with light again, and their story, still wordless, continued to grow. Because sometimes love does not arrive in declarations or dramatic scenes. Sometimes it is brewed slowly, steeped in quiet moments and everyday rituals, until it becomes something undeniable. Sometimes it is found not in words, but in the way two cups sit side by side, and crumbs left like tiny offerings, in the warmth of a gaze shared across a table. And in that cafe, with its soft hum of life and scent of coffee beans, two hearts blended together quietly, steadily, beautifully. It was enough. The mall was a city within the city, alive with neon signs and polished floors that reflected the rhythm of countless footsteps. Escalators hummed steadily, fountains sparkled beneath skylights, and music drifted from every corner, sometimes cheerful, sometimes soft, always part of the mall's endless melody. People came and went, chasing sales, food, or distraction. Yet for two souls, the mall became something else entirely, a stage where affection bloomed in silence, painted not by words, but by the warmth of presence. The boy wandered there often, not out of necessity, but out of habit. He liked the way the bustle of strangers blurred into white noise, giving him space to think. His path usually carried him through the same loops past the bookstore, around the fountain, sometimes up to the rooftop garden when the weather allowed. He wasn't looking for anything specific, but the familiarity soothed him. The girl moved through the mall with an air of curiosity. She lingered at shop windows, not necessarily to buy, but to marvel at the way displays transformed ordinary objects into something magical. A scarf folded into a perfect swirl, a mannequin dressed for winter, even while outside was humid summer, or pastries arranged like tiny works of art in a cafe case. To her, the mall was not just commerce, it was a gallery of small wonders. Their paths first intersected by chance near the central fountain. He had paused on the railing, watching water leap and fall in its rhythmic arcs, when she appeared, leaning closer to drop a coin into the pool. The silver spark disappeared beneath the ripples, and for a moment, both watched it sink. Their eyes brushed briefly, not with recognition, but with the quiet acknowledgement of two strangers sharing a fleeting moment. Yet the mall has a way of weaving threads tighter with each return. Over the weeks, they began to notice one another more often. She at the cafe with her favorite pastries, him lingering near the arcade's claw machines. She flipping through scarves, him studying the rows of shoes. She pausing by the glass railing of the upper floor, him leaning a short distance away. Their meetings weren't planned, but the pattern grew too frequent to dismiss as coincidence. Slowly, a silent companionship took root. It began with small gestures. She once left a half-finished cup of latte on a table in the food court before leaving. He passed by minutes later, spotted it, and sat at the same table as though claiming a seat someone else had saved for him. On another day, she bought a tiny cake, ate half, and carefully slid the untouched half to the side before leaving. Later, he found himself sitting there, smiling faintly at the deliberate neatness of the gesture. He never touched the leftovers, but the care in the act lingered with him. He began returning the gestures in his own way. Passing through the arcade, he tried his luck at the claw machine and, with clumsy persistence, managed to win a small plush keychain. Instead of keeping it, he left it on the bench near the fountain where she often sat. Later that evening, he passed by again, only to see it gone. Days later, he noticed the same keychain dangling from her bag. Their eyes met across the crowd, and though neither spoke, a warmth spread through the silence. The mall became their shared world, familiar and alive with their unspoken rhythm. On weekends, when the mall was crowded, they often drifted toward the rooftop garden. The air was cooler there, with patches of greenery breaking the monotony of glass and tile. She sometimes fed the pigeons with crumbs from her snack, her face lit with quiet amusement. He would stand nearby, hands in his pockets, watching the birds flutter around her like a crown of wings. When one landed close to his shoes, he bent down, and she smiled faintly from across the space, their connection reinforced without a single word. They explored the mall's little corners together, always side by side, never needing dialogue. In the toy store, she pressed buttons on music boxes until one played a soft tune, and he leaned in to listen, the melody etching itself into both their memories. In the bookstore, she flipped through a magazine and left it open on a page showing travel photographs. Hours later, he passed by the same shelf, found the magazine still open, and traced the outline of a faraway mountain with his finger, wondering if she dreamed of going there. Seasons turned, and with them, the mall shifted its face. Summer brought ice cream stalls near the entrances, where she indulged in pastel-colored scoops that melted too quickly. He often arrived just in time to see her tilt her head, trying to catch the drips before they fell, her laughter contained but radiant. Autumn saw them all decorated in warm tones, pumpkins and lanterns hung from railings. They lingered longer then, weaving through the seasonal displays, her hands brushing over scarves, his gaze softening each time she picked up something with childlike wonder. Winter transformed the mall into a wonderland of lights. Strings of twinkling bulbs crisscrossed the ceiling, and the fountain now sprayed mist that glowed under colored beams. Together, they walked slower, taking in the decorations. She stopped at a stall selling snow globes, picking one up to shake it gently. Tiny flakes swirled around a miniature cabin, and she stared as though the little world inside belonged to her. He lingered nearby, watching her expression as much as the snow globe itself. Later, when she left, he bought the same one and placed it quietly on the bench they both favored. Days later, he saw it hanging from her bag, a ribbon tied neatly to its loop. The food court became another layer of their bond. She often sampled little treats, her tray filled with colorful bites she never quite finished. He started leaving a portion of his own meals untouched, sliding them to the edge of his table, as if offering them back into the current of their shared ritual. Neither touched the other's food, but the mirrored gestures spoke volumes. In the arcade, their connection grew livelier. She would play rhythm games, her hands tapping the glowing buttons with surprising speed, her expression glowing with joy. He would watch from a step away, smiling when her score climbed higher. Once she left her game card on the machine before walking away. When he found it, he added credits to it and returned it to the same spot. The next day, he noticed her playing again, a small flicker of surprise crossing her face at the unexpected balance. The rooftop garden became their sanctuary when the crowds grew overwhelming. On one evening, when the city lights shimmered below, she arranged fallen leaves into the shape of a heart on the bench. Hours later, when she had left, he passed by and saw it, untouched but glowing in the dim garden lamps. He sat there for a long time, committing the sight to memory, his chest heavy with feelings that no words could hold. As months passed, their bond deepened into something undeniable. They had never spoken, yet the mall had become a language between them. The shared fountain, the benches, the arcade machines, the rooftop garden. Each corner held memories etched quietly, each season layering their connection further. On a quiet spring afternoon, almost a year from their first meeting, the cherry blossoms outside the mall's entrance bloomed again. She stood beneath them, watching petals drift like pink snowflakes onto the ground. He appeared moments later, carrying a small paper bag from the gift shop. Without hesitation, he set it on the bench near her before stepping back. She picked it up after he left, opening it to find a delicate glass charm shaped like a blossom, tiny petals suspended within. Days later, when he returned to the fountain, he saw the charm hanging from her wrist like a bracelet, catching the light with every movement. It was then that he knew she understood. The mall bustled on with its endless flow of strangers, but for them, it remained something far greater, a place where silence was never empty, where gestures replaced words, where love grew in the spaces between escalators and shop windows. It was not a story of confessions shouted or dramatic gestures performed under spotlights. It was a story built quietly, like layers of music blending into a symphony, like lights reflected on polished floors, like two shadows overlapping as they walked side by side, because sometimes love does not need words. Sometimes it exists in coins dropped into fountains, in snow globes tied with ribbons, in ice cream melting too quickly, in game cards left behind, and leaves arranged into shapes only two people will remember. And so, beneath the endless glow of mall lights, two souls continued their silent story. Hand in hand without ever touching, hearts bound without ever speaking. They found in each other the kind of love that does not need to be heard to be felt. It was enough. The park sat like a hidden gem in the middle of the city, a place where the sounds of traffic softened to birdsong and the air carried the fragrance of grass and blossoms. Trees arched over winding paths, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, and the pond reflected both the sky and the quiet dreams of those who lingered nearby. It was here, beneath the canopy of life and light, that two souls discovered each other. The boy came often, not for company, but for solitude. He liked the stillness that parks held, the kind that let his thoughts settle like dust in sunlight. He would walk the paths slowly, taking in the way light filtered through leaves, how ripples spread across the pond when a fish broke the surface, or how pigeons gathered expectantly when someone scattered crumbs. The girl came with a different energy. She sought the quiet beauty hidden in ordinary things. She crouched to watch ants carrying leaves, gathered petals that had drifted from trees, or tilted her face toward the sky when birds passed overhead. She moved as though she were part of the park itself, light, gentle, and attuned to its rhythm. Their first meeting was not marked by drama, but by a drifting cherry blossom. It floated between them on the spring breeze and landed in the space where both had paused. He looked at the blossom resting on the grass. She looked at him. There was no exchange of words, no acknowledgement beyond a shared stillness. Yet from that moment, something unspoken lingered in the air, delicate as the petal itself. The days that followed seemed to align their visits. Sometimes they crossed paths on opposite ends of the pond. Other times they ended up sitting near the same old tree, whose roots curled like resting arms. Neither sought the other out, yet neither seemed surprised to find the other there. It was as though the park itself guided their steps. As spring deepened, the boy often found himself watching the girl as she placed tiny treasures on the ground arrangements of fallen petals, acorns, or pine needles shaped into patterns. He didn't interrupt, but his eyes softened each time he saw her hands moving carefully, as though she were weaving meaning into the earth. The girl, in turn, noticed how he lingered by the water's edge, tossing small pebbles into the pond, his gaze far away yet peaceful. She didn't intrude, but quietly admired the patience in his movements, the way the ripples stretched outward as if echoing his thoughts. By summer, their connection had grown without a single spoken word. The days were warm, cicadas sang from the trees, and sunlight shimmered off the pond like liquid gold. They began walking the same paths, not side by side at first, but never far apart. If she paused to watch ducks waddle across the grass, he would wait a few steps behind until she moved again. If he stopped to adjust his shoelaces or lean against a railing, she would linger nearby, pretending to study the flowers blooming along the walkway. It was a rhythm of closeness, a dance of silent companionship. One afternoon, when the heat was sharp and heavy, they discovered the park's fountain. The girl dipped her hands into the cool water, splashing it lightly onto her face. Droplets clung to her lashes, glistening like crystals. The boy followed her lead, his movements awkward, but sincere, and when their eyes met through the spray, both smiled soft, wordless, and real. It was a fleeting moment, yet it felt like the kind that etched itself deep into memory. Autumn arrived with a softer palette, and the park transformed into a painting of amber, crimson, and gold. Leaves drifted lazily to the ground, carpeting the paths they now walked together. The boy often picked up a particular livid leaf and held it in his palm, watching its veins glow in the sunlight before setting it gently back on the ground. The girl gathered acorns and small twigs, arranging them at the base of trees like offerings to the season. When the wind stirred, scattering leaves around them in whirls of color, their eyes would meet with the quiet delight of children who had stumbled upon a secret magic. Their bond was never loud, but it was steady. When the air grew crisp, he began bringing an extra thermos of warm tea. Without needing to ask, he set it beside her on the bench, and she accepted with a nod, wrapping her fingers gratefully around the heat. In return, she began leaving folded paper cranes on the bench where they often sat. Sometimes she shaped them from bright wrappers she carried in her pocket, sometimes from plain scraps she found at home. Each crane felt like a piece of her heart, simple yet filled with care. Winter fell, blanketing the park in silence. The pond froze into a mirror, and the trees stood bare, their branches etching delicate lines against the gray sky. The park grew quieter, fewer visitors braving the chill, but the boy and girl continued to return. Bundled in coats and scarves, their breaths clouded in the frosty air as they sat beneath the same old tree, sharing warmth through presence alone. One snowy afternoon, she scooped up fresh snow and molded it into tiny figures, a lopsided cat, a miniature rabbit, a pair of clumsy hearts. She set them on the bench, her cheeks flushed from the cold. The boy watched her with quiet amusement before joining in, shaping a crooked little tower beside hers. They laughed not in sound, but in the light that sparked in their eyes and left their creations for the snow to claim. It was during that winter that the boy realized something had changed inside him. The solitude he once sought in the park no longer carried the same weight. Instead, he found himself waiting for her presence, for the way her small acts of wonder made the world feel brighter. The girl, too, felt the shift. She no longer wandered aimlessly in search of beauty. She had found her greatest treasure in the simple act of being beside him. When spring returned again, blossoms unfurled across the branches of their tree, and the park came alive with renewal. Beneath the same canopy where they had first noticed each other, they sat once more, older by a year, yet closer than ever. She gently placed a cherry blossom in his open hand, and he, in turn, set one of her folded cranes in hers. Their eyes met, and in that moment, every unspoken word was understood. The park bustled around them with children's laughter, the rustle of bicycles, the chatter of couples strolling by. Yet for them, the world seemed to slow, their little corner sealed in a timeless hush. It wasn't grand gestures or declarations that tied them together, but the constancy of presence, the ease of silence, the comfort of knowing someone understood without needing to be told. Their love was built not on words, but on seasons, spring blossoms, summer fountains, autumn leaves, winter snow. It was written in petals placed gently on benches, in warm tea shared on cold days, in folded cranes and crooked snowmen. It was a story lived through gestures, glances, and the quiet certainty of belonging. And so, beneath the whispering trees, their story continued. The boy no longer wandered the park for solitude, for he had found a presence that turned silence into warmth. The girl no longer searched the past for small wonders, for she had discovered her greatest wonder sitting beside her. Together, they became part of the park itself, steady, gentle, and endlessly alive. Because sometimes love does not need to be spoken. Sometimes it exists in the quiet turning of seasons, in the hush of falling leaves, in the stillness of shared benches, and the warmth of unspoken hearts. And in that park, where the world softened and slowed, they found something timeless. The late afternoon sun stretched its golden arms across the horizon, tinting the waves with a gentle fire that shimmered as they rolled to shore. The beach was alive with the rhythm of nature seagulls soaring lazily overhead, the hush of the tide retreating and returning, and the occasional laughter of children chasing kites in the salty breeze. Amid this vibrant landscape stood two figures who seemed almost out of place in their stillness, as if the entire world moved around them while they lingered in their own unspoken universe. The boy had come to the beach, seeking solitude. A sketchbook rested under his arm, though he hadn't touched it all day. His eyes followed the curve of the waves instead, entranced by the endless motion that mirrored the restlessness inside him. He carried dreams he had never voiced aloud, fragile as seashells washed ashore. They seemed to crack whenever he tried to place them into words, so he let silence carry them instead. The girl had come chasing light, She had a habit of finding beauty where most people never looked: shards of sea glass buried in sand, tiny crabs darting across rock pools, the uneven footprints left by strangers. To her, the world was a collection of stories waiting to be treasured. She wandered with the quiet certainty of someone who did not need to own the world to love it. Their paths crossed at the water's edge, not with intention, but with the inevitability of tides. At first, it was only a shared presence, a recognition of another soul lingering where the sky kissed the sea. Yet the simplicity of standing side by side, gazing at the horizon, was enough to plant the smallest seed of something neither could name. As the days passed, they continued to return, sometimes together, sometimes alone, but always ending up side by side as if drawn by invisible strings. They never spoke, yet their silence grew rich with meaning. He carried his sketchbook now, occasionally pressing pencil to paper when the waves inspired him. She would wander a little further, collecting fragments of shells or smoothing patches of sand with her hands. When she placed a shell near him without looking, he would sketch it. When he lingered too long in thought, she would gently set a small treasure at his side, as if reminding him that the world still held beauty waiting to be noticed. The beach became their shared language. On mornings when the tide was low, they traced long paths in the damp sand. He drew arcs and patterns that spiraled outward like stars, and she added shapes that danced between them: flowers, waves, tiny hearts hidden like secrets waiting to be found. By the time the ocean rose again, their creations would be erased, but the memory remained etched deeper than the water could ever reach. During afternoons, the sun painted them in amber light. The boy often caught himself glancing at her when she leaned down to examine a shell, strands of hair falling like silk across her face. The sight stirred something tender inside him, a realization that the beauty he tried so hard to capture in his drawings already existed in the person beside him. The girl, in turn, found her heart warming whenever she saw him frown over his sketches, only to soften when the breeze flipped the pages. She admired the quiet determination in him, the way he seemed to carry storms inside, yet still found the courage to sit by the shore each day. Evenings held a kind of magic all their own. They watched the horizon together, the sun melting into waves that turned from gold to violet. On those nights, the beach emptied, and the world belonged only to them. She would sometimes press her palm against the sand, leaving prints side by side with his, watching as the tide lapped closer, daring the sea to wash away their presence. He would press his hand next to hers, not quite touching, but close enough that the heat of her skin seemed to linger even after the water reclaimed the shore. It was in the smallest gestures that their bond grew. When the wind grew sharp, he would quietly place his sketchbook in her lap, its weight shielding her treasures from scattering. When he lingered too close to the water's pull, she would nudge a pebble into his path, breaking his trance before the tide caught him. They built a rhythm not of words, but of understanding, one that deepened with every shared sunset. Seasons shifted gently around them. The summer heat softened to the mellow embrace of autumn, yet the beach remained their refuge. On cooler evenings, the girl would gather driftwood and arrange them into patterns resembling stars, constellations she had memorized as a child. The boy would trace them onto his pages, capturing both her creations and the quiet joy she radiated while shaping them. Though their hands never touched, their worlds overlapped with seamless grace. As winter approached, the beach grew quieter, fewer footsteps marking the sand. Yet the two remained, wrapped in scarves and coats, their breaths visible in the crisp air. The sea roared louder in those months, its waves more restless, mirroring the storm of feelings building inside them. The boy often paused mid-sketch, his heart caught between wanting to express everything and fearing the moment would shatter if he tried. The girl sometimes lingered too long over her seashells, holding them like fragile confessions, her chest heavy with a warmth she could not release. One evening, as the year neared its end, the beach offered them a moment that felt like destiny. The sun had already dipped beyond the horizon, leaving the world bathed in twilight. The tide was high, the waves rushing with urgency, erasing everything in their path. She had placed her collection of shells in a small circle on the sand, a quiet offering to the sea. He had sketched the scene with hurried strokes, his heart racing as if he could not capture it fast enough. Then, without warning, a wave surged forward, stronger than the rest, sweeping away her arrangement in an instant. She gasped softly, her hands frozen mid-reach. For a moment, sorrow flickered across her face. But when she turned, she found the boy holding his sketchbook toward her. On the page, her circle of shells remained intact, eternal, safe from the tide. Their eyes met, and in that unspoken exchange, something shifted. The world seemed to pause around them, the waves pulling back in reverence, the sky darkening as stars began to pierce the night. They had not spoken a single word since the day they first met, yet everything they had ever felt was etched in that gaze. She smiled softly, a smile that reached her eyes, and he returned it with a quiet certainty that needed no explanation. From that evening on, the beach was no longer just a place of escape or discovery. It became the canvas of their love story. Each tide, each shell, each sketch was a thread weaving them closer. The boy no longer sketched only the sea or the horizon. His pages filled with fragments of her, the tilt of her head, the curve of her smile, the way her footprints trailed behind her like poetry written on sand. The girl, in turn, began to leave her treasures not at random but with intention seashell hearts. Pebble constellations, driftwood arranged in patterns only he would understand. Their silence remained, yet it grew richer, more eloquent than words could ever hope to be. When spring returned, bringing warmth and life back to the beach, their bond had already taken root so deeply that it no longer needed proof. They walked side by side, their shadows stretching across the sand, no longer hesitant, no longer searching. The boy finally closed his sketchbook one evening and set it aside, choosing instead to watch her with unguarded eyes. She noticed and placed her latest treasure, a single perfect shell, into his open hand. The gesture spoke more than any confession ever could. He held it tightly, the weight of it grounding him, anchoring his heart in a certainty he had long yearned for. And so the beach continued to hold their story. The tides rose and fell. The seasons turned. The world shifted endlessly around them. Yet through it all, two figures remained side by side, their hearts bound by the quiet constancy of waves, by the golden hush of sunsets, by the silence that had always been enough. Their love was never about grand declarations or sweeping gestures. It was about the warmth of unspoken understanding, about finding someone who turned silence into comfort and solitude into companionship. It was about building a world on a shoreline where everything washed away, yet nothing was ever truly lost. Because on that beach, amid the endless dance of sea and sky, they had found each other. And that was enough. The bell above the tea house door chimed, a familiar melody that stirred something within Ren. Hana entered, a faint dusting of flour clinging to her, a stark contrast to the immaculate serenity of his family's establishment. He prepared her usual green tea, a silent ritual, a subtle extra dollop of honey added without a word. She accepted it with a grateful smile, a shared understanding passing between them, their days unfolded in quiet observation. Ren watched her animated explanations of baking triumphs and culinary mishaps, her hands gesturing expressively. She watched him, a figure of serene precision, moving with practiced grace amidst teacups and floral arrangements. His world was order, hers a delightful whirlwind. Yet their glances, the lingering warmth in their shared silence, wove a subtle connection. One stormy afternoon, Henna rushed in, not for tea, but with a palpable urgency. Her hands mimed a broken oven, her face a picture of despair over the impending cherry blossom festival. Ren's calm facade wavered, a flash of concern in his eyes. He gestured towards the back of the tea house, a silent offer of his family's rarely used traditional oven. His movements conveyed a willingness to help, even to join her in her frantic task. Hannah's wide-eyed surprise slowly morphed into immense relief. That night, the tea house kitchen, usually a space of quiet preparation, became a flurry of activity. Ren, an apron replacing his customary kimono, moved with a newfound clumsiness amidst flour and mixing bowls. Hannah, a whirlwind of energy, silently guided him. He sifted, he mixed, his movements slowly gaining a hesitant rhythm. A playful sneeze from Ren sent a puff of flour onto Hannah's nose. Her soft laugh, the gentle brush of her finger against his cheek as she wiped a smudge, spoke volumes. They toiled through the night, the air thick with the sweet scent of cherry blossoms and red bean paste, a silent symphony of shared effort. As dawn broke, casting soft light through the paper screens, a mountain of finished pastries rested on cooling racks. Exhaustion lined their faces, but triumph shone in their eyes. Hannah collapsed onto a chair, a joyful, silent expression of gratitude washing over her. Ren, leaning against the counter, felt a warmth that transcended fatigue. He looked at her, messy and content, and a new understanding settled within him. His hand reached out, gently brushing a final speck of flour from her cheek. Their eyes met, a profound, silent conversation passing between them, a recognition of something deeper than friendship. Their daily tea ritual deepened. Longer glances, unspoken questions and answers, a quiet unfolding. Hannah began to bring him small, carefully wrapped samples of her latest creations, offering them with a shy smile. Ren accepted them with a gentle nod, his appreciation evident in his gaze. One sun-drenched afternoon, under the full bloom of the cherry blossoms, Hannah entered, not for tea, but with a small, intricately decorated bento box. She held it out to him, her cheeks flushed, a silent offering of gratitude and something more. Ren took it, their fingers brushing, a subtle jolt passing between them. He looked at her, framed by the falling pink petals, and a quiet certainty bloomed in his chest. His gaze held hers, a silent declaration in his eyes. Hannah met his gaze, her own eyes soft with understanding. A shared smile, a gentle nod, and the unspoken words hung in the air, carried on the gentle spring breeze. Their hands found each other, a silent promise exchanged amidst the scent of blossoms and warm tea, a new chapter quietly beginning. The village rested quietly at the foot of a wide valley, where rolling hills, embraced clusters of rice fields and narrow paths wound between wooden houses with tiled roofs. The rhythm of life there was unhurried. Roosters crowed at dawn, smoke curled from kitchen chimneys at dusk, and the air carried a blend of earth, flowers, and wood fire. For most, it was simply home. For two hearts, it would become something more. The boy lived on the edge of the village, where his family's fields stretched toward the river. Each morning, he helped gather water, carrying heavy pails along the narrow path that followed the riverbank. He was steady, quiet, accustomed to the weight of responsibility. Yet in those still mornings, when sunlight reflected off the water, he often felt a longing for something undefined, as though the current carried with it a dream he could never quite name. The girl had arrived to the village from elsewhere. Her family had moved into a modest home not far from the shrine on the hill. While the villagers knew each other's roots through generations, she was the unfamiliar branch. She wandered the paths often, her steps light, her gaze drawn to details others overlooked, dragonflies gliding above the patties, the glimmer of dew on wildflowers, the way clouds mirrored themselves in water. Though she was new, her presence blended into the landscape as naturally as the wind through bamboo. Their paths first crossed near the river. He had paused on the bank, resting his pails against a stone, when she appeared, crouching to dip her hands into the water. She looked up as droplets slipped from her fingers, and for a moment their eyes met. There were no words, no introductions, only the sound of the river rushing between them. Yet something lingered in that quiet exchange, a recognition, faint and fleeting, like a breeze brushing the skin before disappearing. From then on, the seasons seemed to conspire to bring them together. Spring arrived with the scent of blossoms carried on warm winds. The fields shimmered with tender shoots of rice, and the hills blushed with cherry trees scattering petals like snow. The boy worked with his family, bending to plant seedlings in the mud. The girl wandered the same fields, her steps careful as she followed dragonflies hovering over the water. She paused to watch him, though from a distance, admiring the patience in his movements, the way he pressed each seedling into the earth as if tucking it gently into bed. When he looked up, she quickly turned toward the blossoms, pretending to chase petals as they danced to the ground. Soon, spring evenings became moments they quietly shared. He often sat on the porch after work, washing his hands and watching the sky soften into gold. She would walk the lane below, carrying baskets from the market. Neither waved, yet their glances met, carrying warmth across the distance. By the time fireflies began to flicker along the paths, they had already built an unspoken familiarity. Summer descended with its chorus of cicadas and air thick with heat. The river became a refuge. Children splashed near its shallows, elders gathered on the banks, and fishermen cast their lines from small wooden boats. The boy often went there at dusk, washing away the day's sweat, letting the current cool his skin. The girl appeared too, sitting on flat stones with her feet dipped in the water, her sandals placed neatly beside her. On one evening, he arrived just as she was arranging small pebbles into patterns on the stone circles. Spirals, little constellations made of earth. He sat a little distance away, skimming flat stones across the water's surface. The ripples brushed against the patterns she had made, blurring them slightly, and when she looked up, she found him watching. She didn't frown. Instead, she added another pebble, reshaping the spiral, and he flicked another stone, this time aiming it so the ripple expanded gently around her design instead of through it. The river carried their silence like a song. Summer nights brought festivals to the village. Lanterns glowed along the main street, taiko drums echoed, and fireworks bloomed against the dark. Amid the crowd, the boy and girl saw each other again, both standing quietly at the edge, away from the laughter and noise. The light of the fireworks painted their faces, her eyes bright with wonder, his lips curved in a faint smile. They did not stand together, but when the final spark fell from the sky, their gazes met across the crowd, carrying the secret joy of having witnessed the same beauty. Autumn turned the valley into a painting of ochre, crimson, and gold. The rice fields shimmered in golden waves, ready for harvest, and the air carried the scent of ripe persimmons and wood smoke. The boy worked long hours helping with the harvest, sweat clinging to his brow, his hands rough from sickle and rope. The girl passed often along the paths, carrying baskets of fruit or flowers. Once, she placed a bright orange persimmon on the stone where he rested his tools, slipping away before he could see. When he returned, he paused at the sight of the fruit. Without hesitation, he tucked it into his pocket, carrying it home like a treasure. In the evenings, the girl gathered fallen leaves near the shrine. She shaped them into little designs along the steps' hearts, circles, flowing lines that crunched softly beneath passing feet. The boy discovered them once when he walked there at twilight. He stopped, studying the delicate arrangements, and though the wind scattered them soon after, he remembered their shape clearly. The next day, he paused by the same steps and arranged a few leaves of his own, not with skill, but with sincerity. When she arrived later, her eyes softened at the sight, her chest swelling with a warmth she carried all the way home. Winter blanketed the village in silence. Snow softened the fields, icicles hung from rooftops, and the river froze along its edges. The boy continued his chores, breaking ice to fetch water, his breath forming clouds in the sharp air. The girl walked slower, wrapped in scarves, her footprints trailing behind her in the snow. On one morning, she paused on the bridge to trace a heart into the frost that clung to its railing. Hours later, when he crossed the same bridge, he noticed the faint mark and placed his gloved hand over it, leaving behind a print that overlapped hers. He walked on, not realizing that she had lingered in the distance, watching with a quiet smile that melted the chill in her chest. Winter nights were long, but the village held warmth in its gatherings. Neighbors shared stews, laughter echoed in homes, and lanterns flickered against snowy windows. The boy and girl, though never seated together, often found themselves across the same table during village meals. Their eyes met over steaming bowls, and though surrounded by voices, they shared a silence that belonged only to them. When spring returned, blossoms filled the air once more. A full year had passed since their first glance by the river. The boy stood again at its bank, carrying water, when he noticed her crouched by the shallows, cupping blossoms that had drifted downstream. She placed them gently onto the surface, watching as they floated away, and he paused, letting his pails rest on the stone. Their eyes met, just as they had the first time. But this time, their gazes did not break quickly. They lingered, steady and warm, carrying the weight of a year's worth of seasons shared. The river rushed between them, blossoms drifted, the fields stirred in the breeze, and still they looked at one another, the silence rich with all the things they had never spoken aloud. In that moment, it became clear. Love did not always bloom through words. Sometimes it grew in gestures as small as a persimmon on a stone, a pebble spiral by the river, a handprint left in frost. Sometimes it unfolded through seasons of glances, through paths crossed and moments quietly shared. And so, in the village where hills embrace fields, where the river met the earth, two hearts found their place woven into the rhythm of nature, bound by the constancy of seasons and held together by the language of silence. Because love, like a village, does not need to rush. It only needs to endure, steady as water, patient as earth, and gentle as the petals that fall each spring.